Hi, everyone. It's your old pal Douglas again. This is my talk that I gave at the Australian Archaeological Association virtual conference held this December, well, I guess it's still December, isn't it? I presented at the Hard Science and Hard Tissue Osteological Evidence for Human Behaviour and Biology session convened by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Angie Leece. Um, And I was planning on recording the video and audio feed from that presentation while I gave the talk, but I didn't. So I'm just going to try to recreate it for you here. So again, I guess hold on to your butts. Now, if you'll indulge me a little bit, this is going to cover a lot of the same material from my previous costs of carnivory talk, which you can find somewhere on my YouTube channel. It shouldn't be too hard. There's only a couple videos right now. I believe in you. Um, but we're looking at this topic from a slightly different perspective now. We're gonna try to take a look at the thylacine um, from a viewpoint of the stories that surround it, and get into the truthiness behind some of those stories. And so really, this talk, um, this is a story about storytelling. It's about taking a closer look at the things that we take at face value and pulling on some of the wayward threads. Now, for those that would like an introduction to the main character of our story, the thylacine was the largest marsupial predator to persist to modern times. It's a distant relative to the numbat, quolls, and Tasmanian devil, and it lived throughout Australia and New Guinea until a little over 3,000 years ago, at which point it was restricted to the island of Tasmania. Now, by 1840, a bounty had been placed on them because the European colonists were afraid they'd eat their sheep, and within 100 years, they were extinct. This rapid extermination means that we don't have much in the way of basic biological information, such as body mass. We don't even know how much the thylacine weighed. All that we have left are the records from the time, the stories and accounts from those that saw them in life. Now, currently, the most commonly cited average mass for the thylacine is 29.5 kilos from Paddle's book, The Last Tasmanian Tiger, which really is, at its bones, a work built upon collecting these period accounts. So it's really, really great for this kind of almost observational source material. Now, for those of you who don't just automatically see a number and understand how big that is, for reference, this is about the weight of a below average wolf, two coyotes, or three Tasmanian devils in a trench coat carrying a house cat. Now, back in 2016, when I started my PhD, I went to the Smithsonian Institution and opened up my first box of thylacine, and I immediately thought, oh, wait a minute, that's that's not the skull of a 30-kilo animal. That's too small. So I went back to the book. Looking closer at that paddle value of 29.5 kilos, it became clear that it was based on this quote, this range given in the Victorian Intercolonial Exhibition pamphlet. Now, the problem is that going back to that source, it really reads like it's talking about a top end to their size, not a range, but they can sometimes get to 60 to 70 pounds. So, where else can we look? Luckily, there are a small handful of other period accounts of the thylacine that do provide weights. But when you look closely at them, it starts to look like they might have exaggerated a few things here and there in the retelling of these harrowing accounts. That's a little worrisome. Now, if we're just concerned about the size of the thylacine and not whether it could break a shotgun with its mouth, There are a small number of accounts that do give masses and dimensions, so we can start to get a picture as to the proportions of the animal. Unfortunately, these are all over the place. And more importantly, they're all from after the late 1860s, which is nearly 30 years or more after the initiation of the Van Diemen Land Company bounty scheme, and around the same time as the initiation of the government sponsored bounty. All except for one account, the first official record of the Thylacine from Lieutenant Governor Patterson. Now, this incredibly detailed report is from 1805, well before the bounty schemes. And interestingly, it provides a much lower mass than the other accounts. So we've got multiple accounts recorded after a vested interest was taken in the extermination of the thylacine, and a single well-documented account from before the bounty schemes. And none of these accounts really agree with each other. So again, we're left with no real answer, just a bunch of conflicting stories. This meant that we had to figure out the thylacine's mass ourselves. But how do you weigh an extinct animal? Well, the most common method of doing so is by using dental metric regressions. And with marsupials, that means using Myers dental regressions. The problem is they were generated using Paddle's 29.5 kilo value for the thylacine, so that's just not good. It doesn't work. I had to figure out a way to get an accurate mass for these animals, so I had to think of something else. Now, luckily, there are several ways to do this. One of the earliest methods of mass estimation is volumetric. Simply dunk a model or even a toy into some water and just record how much spills out, right? The volume displaced. Or you can build regressions from measurements of the head or teeth, like Myers did. These methods are very popular since fossil mammals are really just teeth, right? And skulls are by far the most common osteological item in museum collections, even for modern animals. Or you could use measurements from the limbs, which makes a lot of sense, right? Since they're the things that have to hold the animal up. But limb bones are pretty rare in the fossil record. And even for living animals in museum collections, limb bones can be pretty darn rare. Way, way fewer in collections than heads. Recently, the volume method has gone digital, and it's way less mess. For example, you can generate a set of minimum convex holes around a scanned skeleton. Of course, this kind of does require a reasonably complete skeleton, which that's asking an awful lot from an extinct animal. Or you can take it almost full circle again and go back to sculpting models, but just do it digitally. This also does benefit from a full skeleton, but since you're sculpting, you can use your artistic and biological intuition to assist. Of course, that also helps if you have artistic talent, but you could always support your local artist, right? So what did I do? Well, I picked a little from column A, picked a little from column B, and went about getting myself some thylacines. I enlisted the help of Ben Myers at ThingLab, and we visited Museums Victoria and the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, where Ben used the Artec 3D Leo surface scanner, which was kind of like brand new, really expensive. We borrowed it from ThingLab. He wouldn't let me touch it because apparently I don't have a trustworthy face, but he used it to quickly scan whole mounted skeletons and taxidermies. My supervisors were able to gain access to and scan the only whole body thylacine in the world at the Swedish Museum of Natural History. Using these scans, my wonderful local artist, it's not really local, but everything's local these days, right? The world is at our fingertips. Mr. Demir Martin, incredibly talented, digitally sculpted models from their skeletons, giving us taxidermy mounts, mounted skeletons, and volumetric models to weigh. With all of this, we were able to weigh the thylacines with multiple methods by measuring the circumference of their limbs, by generating minimum convex hulls, and by generating lifelike models. These could then be weighed and compared with the values that we got from the taxidermies and the traditional dental metrics. So how does it all stack up? Well, we found that the dental estimates are all higher than the volumetric estimates, which all agree with each other really well. And the volumetrics agreed really well with the limb-based estimates. Now, since we have a lot more limb bones than we do whole-mounted skeletons or taxidermies, we decided to treat those limb estimates as accurate mass values. And then we regressed those against associated crania from the same animals so that we could then build a corrected set of craniodental regressions because we've got a lot of skulls, right? This allowed us to weigh 93 individual thylacines. Now, turns out the average adult thylacine was somewhere around 16.7 kilos, 13.7 for females, 19.7 for males. That's just over half the previous estimate of 29.5 kilos. So why do we care? What is so important about getting the story of the thylacine's weight right? Well, it turns out that if you take a predator's body mass and you plot it against their prey's mass, an interesting thing happens. You get this weird inflection point here at 21 kilos. Now, to help orient ourselves, let's go ahead and label a couple of points. There's a wolf and a coyote. Okay, now, analyzing this data, researchers found that this 21 kilo line marks an energetics threshold where below 21 kilos, most predators take prey less than 45% of their own mass. Above 21 kilos, they almost all take prey larger than 45% of their own mass, sometimes even greater than their own mass. So they called this energetics threshold here the costs of carnivory. Looking back at that predator to prey body mass chart, where does the thylacine fit? Well, it turns out that unlike previous estimates, it does not fit on the right of that 21 kilo threshold with things like the wolf, but below the threshold with small prey focused predators, things like foxes, coyotes. This strongly suggests a prey preference of animals smaller than half of their own mass on average. Things like patamons, bilbies, bandicoots. Not big game like the wolf at all. Which means that the stories of their weight may have had a hand in unfairly dooming the species. We are storytelling creatures. It's true. But we have to remember that stories and their subjects grow and change in the telling. Stories have meaning and purpose, but they don't always reflect reality, not faithfully at least. They can stretch and twist reality in the retelling to suit the stories or the storyteller's needs. But we also have to remember that regardless of how much a story reflects reality, stories can have a very real effect on reality. Again, thank you for joining me and listening in.